Segment 5, your title, America Alone. You sum up European disdain for the United States by quoting the British journalist Brian Reed, who writes that Americans are, quote, self-righteous, gun-totin', military-lovin', sister-marryin', abortion-hatin', gay-loathin', foreigner-despisin', non-passport-ownin' rednecks. To which Mark Steyn replies...
I think you left out the most colourful bit of that description.
Well, there's a bit that's...
rather vivid micturitions.
Yeah,
who think that I think God gave them the biggest manhood in the world. I'm being discreet there, so that they could urinate on the rest of the planet. It's something like that.
To which Mark Steyn replies, if one were to formulate it less disapprovingly, Brian Reed's Anatomy of Americans equals... quoting you now, culturally confident, self-reliant, patriotic, procreative, religious, democratic, constitutional rednecks who believe in national sovereignty rather than ineffectual poseur multilateralism, close quote. What makes the United States different?
Well, I think the United States is still different. I think it's clear that there's a big slab of the population here that is attracted to the idea of being like Europe. Europe has only been able to be like Europe the last 60 years because the United States has served as the guarantor of last resort. In effect, Germany doesn't need an army because the US Army lives in Germany, and so Germany has been free to spend its defense budget on socialized healthcare and all kinds of other things. In effect, US taxpayers pay for the German healthcare system.
In 2010, this year, we still have 50,000 troops. 60-some years after the end of the Second World War, we still have 50,000 troops in Germany. Right,
which is ridiculous, and any time anybody talks about withdrawing them, as Secretary Rumsfeld does, the argument now that was advanced at the time is that the closure of those bases would be devastating for surrounding German supermarkets and restaurants.
Right.
So that is why the United States taxpayer pays to keep this vast army in Germany, is because otherwise those supermarkets and restaurants would go out of business. So if America goes down the European path, who is going to be the sugar daddy for America in the way that America served as the sugar daddy for Europe? There isn't one. But what heartens me is that America is not yet European. I was very despondent by the results of as you can imagine, of the 2008 election. But what was interesting to me is the nature of the rebellion against that. There was the financial crisis, which happened in a lot of countries. And in a lot of places, from Iceland to Bulgaria, you had massive demonstrations of people pounding on the door of Parliament saying, why didn't you, the government, do more for us? This is the only country in the Western world where a mass protest movement rose up saying, why don't you do less for us? Why don't you get the hell out of our pocket? Why don't you keep out of our lives, big government, and we do just fine? And it's not clear to me whether it speaks for 50.001% of the American people, but it speaks for a significant chunk of them, and that differentiates the United States from most of the other Western nations.
You write, Mark, there are three possible resolutions to the present struggle. Again, I'm quoting from America Alone. 1, submit to Islam, but that would mean the end of Western civilization. 2, destroy Islam, but, quote, the slaughter would change America beyond recognition, close quote. 3, reform Islam, but, quote, ultimately only Muslims can reform Islam. All the free world can do is create conditions that increase the likelihood of Muslim reform, close quote. What kinds of conditions are those?
Well, I think historically Islam has only been moderated by the overarching society. I mean, to an extent, the British Raj moderated Islam in India. It had problems with Wahhabist violence in the 19th century. They assassinated a viceroy and a chief justice in imperial India. But generally speaking, the British Raj did have a moderating impact. The Indonesian dictatorship had a moderating impact on radical Islam. the Soviet Union did. The Central Asian stands were very agreeable places to be when the Soviet Union bust up. They have this disgusting alcohol they drink there. They're incredible. The world's most relaxed Muslims drinking this hooch, very pleasant company. What happened was that the Iranians and Saudis then spent a ton of money radicalizing those people. So that teaches us a lesson. The lesson here is if you're not on ideological offense, you're going to get rolled. This idea that somehow our deference to Islam prevents us from, to make the Christopher Hitchens point, identifying the various mom and pop strains of Islam around the planet that we're in favor of, or just letting the House of Saud and the Iranian mullahs annex anything that takes their fancy, is a recipe for disaster. None of those precedents are attractive to Americans, because Americans don't think the Indonesian dictatorship or the Soviet Union or even the British Raj are terribly attractive. So they're not in the ideological game.
What's the program for the United States?
Well, I think
if you we set Barack Obama to one side and make you president, or let's do it for experimental for the purposes of mental experiment. Let's make you dictator. What should the United States do?
Well, for a start, I would end ideological subversion of the United States and the Western world. I don't think
you tell the Saudis you stop supporting exporting Wahhabism.
Yeah, because basically the Saudis export ideology, not oil. Oil simply funds the export of ideology, and I would stop that, and I would do everything to stop it. I think the tragedy is that the Saudis are reaching the point where they've just about bought up everything they need to buy up in the Western world. Secondly, I do think that unless you have real serious cultural confidence, you should not have mass Muslim immigration. My view on that, I say that with regret, because I would like to believe that all societies can bring people there and create Americans, create Canadians, create Englishmen, create Dutchmen. But if you look at England, Englishmen whose families have been living there since 1066 are no longer English in any meaningful way. So the idea that you can take some child bride off the boat from Mirpur and turn her into a functioning British subject in any way is, I think, highly dubious. And so I do think that at some point we have to grasp the nettle of mass immigration, which is always a sign of societal weakness. Whatever one feels about it in theory, a dependence on mass immigration is a sign of a structural defect in society.
Final question, Mark. This will take a moment or two to set up, but I think it's evocative enough to make it worthwhile. Two assessments of the future. Malcolm Muggeridge, the great late British journalist, who in his later years used to tell young people when he was lecturing in this country, as indeed he told me, that we would soon find ourselves in the position of St. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, North Africa, who writes the City of God as news of the sack of Rome reaches him. This flower of classical civilization, St. Augustine, who in his own lifetime watches it all slip away. That's assessment one. Assessment two, the present Pope, Benedict XVI. You write yourself, again in America alone, quote, the future implicit in then Cardinal Ratzinger's name for his papacy, Benedict XVI. St. Benedict is born in Umbria, 480, just 50 years after the death of Augustine, and St. Benedict ensured, quoting you, that critical elements of civilization were preserved and that they would emerge as the basis for Europe and Western civilization. Pope Benedict XVI once quoted a Benedictine motto, pruned, it grows again. So you have Malcolm Muggeridge, sorry chaps, it's the end. And you've got Benedict XVI, who seems to be suggesting that after a period of struggle, rebirth.
I think it was easier in the original Benedict's day. I am worried that we are essentially delivering Western technology, which can peer into every nook and cranny of our lives. And we are creating transnational institutions that will end up being run by profoundly illiberal sources. If you look at the biggest voting bloc at the United Nations, for example, it's the Organization of the Islamic Conference. That's an interesting name. If it was, what would the left make if there was a group of nations called the Organization of the Christian Conference?
Right.
They'd be hopping mad about it.
Right.
But they're not about the Organization of the Islamic Conference. 58 nations who make the running, especially in things like the Human Rights Council at the UN. So in other words, these international institutions that were set up mainly by the United States in the late 1940s because the US didn't want to be an imperial superpower. So it created these transnational institutions that have now that are falling remorselessly into the hands of the enemies of liberal societies. And I think that gives the second Benedict a tougher job than the first Benedict has. I don't want to subscribe to Malcolm Muggeridge defeatism. I'm a happy warrior. But turning this thing around is going to be hellish work. And I think at a certain point we're going to find little citadels of light on what is otherwise a very dark planet. In other words, I think pruned it grows again, maybe, but the pruning is going to be far more severe than we yet know.
Mark Steyn, author of America Alone, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.